History, they say, is written by the victors. But the dark truth is that history is often defined by what the victors desperately attempt to erase. For centuries, the royal families of Europe, the keepers of power, the masters of the Atlantic, have possessed secrets so catastrophic, so terrifyingly unexplainable, that their very survival depended on absolute silence. This document, labeled only Project Crimson, was once stored in the lowest, most secure vault beneath the admiralty of a major maritime power. It detailed a single, impossible day in the summer of 1755, a day when the Atlantic Ocean defied nature, science, and God itself. This wasn't an algae bloom. Inanimate. This wasn't a trick of the light. According to the sealed records, the ocean surface, covering hundreds of square miles, was chemically transformed. It was a boiling, steaming, vast expanse of blood-red liquid. The year 1755 is known to every historian for the devastating Great Lisbon Earthquake, a natural catastrophe that redefined Europe. But the records of Project Crimson suggest that disaster struck the crown days before the earth shook. A massive convoy, the pride of the fleet, carrying immense wealth, gold, spices, and state secrets, vanished en route to the colonial ports. Distress signals poured into the coastal listening posts, but they spoke not of pirate attacks or storms. The messages were confused, terrified, mentioning boiling water and a sea of blood. The final, desperate transmission mentioned only one word: contamination. The loss of the fleet was devastating, but the response from the reigning monarch, King George IV, was immediate, unprecedented, and deeply suspicious. Within hours, a royal decree was issued, not to initiate a rescue, but to launch Operation Blackout, a mission to locate and destroy every last piece of evidence related to the red water and the fate of the convoy. Why the panic? Losing a fleet was common in the 18th century. But the crown's fear was existential. The royal agents seized all ship logs, destroyed distress signal transcripts, and intimidated any surviving witness into permanent silence. The official cause of the disaster was logged as a simple, powerful, but fictitious, unprecedented meteorological event. The crown was not merely protecting its wealth, it was protecting the illusion of its divine right and absolute control over the elements. To admit that the very ocean could be chemically corrupted on such a colossal scale by an unknown, possibly man-made phenomenon was to admit a profound weakness, a vulnerability that enemies and rebellious colonies alike could exploit. The royals feared the implication of the Crimson Tide. They feared that the phenomenon was not a natural occurrence, but the result of a secret, destructive experiment gone horribly wrong, a scientific hubris that threatened to poison the world. The true key to the cover-up lies within the HMS Dominon, the flagship of the convoy, which carried a clandestine laboratory and a deadly scientific cargo code, named Project Veritas. The king had authorized the creation of a weapon that swallowed his own fleet whole. The official manifests listed the HMS Dominion as the protector of the convoy, but its true designation was far more dangerous. The Dominion was, in fact, a traveling royal laboratory, a floating workshop for a team of disgraced alchemists and brilliant but dangerous experimental chemists. This operation, financed directly by the royal treasury, was the ultimate secret weapon program, Project Veritas, Project Truth. The goal of Project Veritas was to grant the crown absolute naval supremacy. Their objective was to develop a substance that could instantaneously neutralize any enemy fleet. In the 18th century, naval power was measured by copper. Ships were sheathed in copper to resist barnacles and shipworms. The royals sought a chemical that could instantly strip the copper sheathing from a hull, rendering the enemy vessel dead in the water and vulnerable to decay. The head of Project Veritas, a mysterious and highly guarded scientist known only by the pseudonym Dr. Either, believed he had achieved this goal. His creation was named the Argentum Solvent, a terrifyingly potent acid compound far exceeding anything known in contemporary chemistry. Dr. Ether claimed this solvent could dissolve most known metals within minutes of exposure, a claim that struck equal measures of awe and terror into the heart of the Admiralty. The solvent was a composite of several unstable elements, but its power lay in a highly refined, reddish-brown metallic oxide. This oxide, processed from a rare mineral mined deep in the colonial South American territories, was the catalyst. When stabilized with a base of distilled sulfur compounds, It became the Argentum Solvent. However, Dr. Etha's team had a critical, fatal flaw in their understanding of the compound's dynamics. The solvent was designed for concentrated, targeted attack. It was never tested for stability or reaction under the massive dilution and complex salinity of the open ocean. The scientists believed their lead-lined, reinforced containers, secured deep within the Dominion's hull, were impenetrable. They failed to account for the relentless, dynamic, and unpredictable forces of the mid-Atlantic storm season of 1755. The Dominion was transporting the final, large batch supply of this unstable chemical to the colonies to begin mass production. This volatile cargo represented not just a potential weapon, but a monumental investment, a national risk that the Crown sought to protect at any cost. This is the only reason the king felt compelled to later impose the extreme, immediate measures of Operation Blackout. The disaster began days into the voyage, far from any land. Severe storms buffeted the convoy, and the sheer G-forces exerted on the massive Dominion caused the supposedly impenetrable lead-lined casks to strain. According to the recovered fragments of a quartermaster's log, a document hidden from the royal sweep, the seals on the primary solvent container finally fractured. A subtle corrosive mist, described as having the metallic scent of copper mixed with an intense burning citrus, began to fill the lower decks. The scientific team, facing impending disaster, panicked. They feared the toxic fumes would kill the crew and melt the ship from the inside out. Their fatal decision, driven by sheer terror and scientific hubris, was to vent the dangerous fumes and the leaking liquid directly into the sea. They believed the sheer volume of the Atlantic would render the chemical harmless. They couldn't have been more wrong. The exposure of the high-energy metallic oxide to the massive volume of sodium chloride, salt, in the seawater triggered the instantaneous exothermic hypercascade, a runaway reaction that was both chemical and thermal. The result was not dilution, but the creation of a vast, corrosive, boiling chemical weapon that enveloped the entire convoy in a cloud of its own making. The sea was no longer the enemy. It was the catalyst for an apocalyptic reaction. The single, fatal error of venting the Argentum solvent into the sea initiated a chemical apocalypse that defies easy categorization. This was not a slow poisoning. It was an instantaneous chemical firestorm. The reaction between the highly energized reddish metallic oxide and the massive concentration of salt in the Atlantic triggered an unprecedented hyperthermal cascade. Within minutes, the ocean's temperature surged. Over an area spanning hundreds of square miles, the water began to boil violently. This was the source of the terrible hissing and steam mentioned in the final frantic signals. The vivid, shocking crimson color, the crimson tide, was the visual byproduct of the chemically altered water intensely reflecting light, creating the horrifying illusion of a bleeding sea. The convoy, struggling against the heavy storms, was suddenly plunged into an inferno. The heat alone was enough to scald the crews above deck. Below the waterline, the corrosive nature of the chemically charged water began its work. The very material the Argentum solvent was designed to attack, the iron fittings and copper sheathing of the ships, began to dissolve violently, releasing thick noxious clouds of chlorine and sulfurous gas that enveloped the entire fleet. The vessels were being simultaneously cooked, corroded, and poisoned. Discipline, the backbone of any 18th century navy, evaporated instantly in the face of this unprecedented terror. The crews were trapped in a hellish nightmare. Crews below deck suffocated on the chemical fumes and chlorine gas. Those above deck faced scalding steam, and the psychologically shattering sight of their world turned to blood. The surviving fragments of the quartermaster's log, recovered by a lucky few who had deserted the convoy days earlier, paints a picture of absolute chaos. The crew, believing the disaster to be the devil's punishment for the forbidden scientific work of Project Veritas, turned on the alchemist in the final moments of the HMS Dominion. Full-scale mutiny erupted. The sailors, driven mad by the heat and the sight of the blood tide, attempted to seize the remaining solvent containers, perhaps believing they could throw the rest overboard to appease the poison sea, or tragically to use the deadly chemical against their officers. This internal war sealed the fate of the flagship, guaranteeing the breach of any remaining stability and ensuring the maximum possible saturation of the deadly chemical into the Atlantic. The Royal Crown, having intercepted the terrifying final signals, immediately understood the political and military catastrophe. This wasn't just a lost convoy. It was proof that the Crown had sponsored the development of an indiscriminate chemical weapon, a violation of early, tentative international laws of warfare. If the truth of the boiling Red Ocean got out, their moral authority and their naval dominance would collapse. King George II ordered Operation Blackout. The mission was simple, brutal, and without mercy. Dispatch the fastest vessels to the edge of the Crimson Tide. Find any trace of wreckage, survivors, or documents, and destroy them immediately. The Royal Navy ships that approached the disaster zone found their grim task already half completed. The acidic, corrosive water had worked with terrifying efficiency. The entire convoy had not just sunk, it had been dissolved. Hulls were rendered brittle, wood was bleached, and iron was reduced to rust and sludge. There were no intact bodies, no survivors, and no recoverable logbooks. The ocean had swallowed the evidence of its own agonizing death. The only chance of discovering the truth now rested on one small, independent trading vessel, the Wanderer, whose captain was sailing far enough away to witness the impossible color, but close enough to be targeted by the subsequent Royal Purge. The Royal Crown's Operation Blackout was chillingly effective in destroying the official records of the Crimson Tide. But they failed to account for independent witnesses, captains sailing far enough from the disaster to survive the chemical plume, but close enough to witness the impossible sight. Our key to unlocking this royal secret is Captain Elias Thorne, master of the trading ketch, the Wanderer. Captain Thorne was heading east, about 50 miles from the projected disaster zone. He chronicled the approaching phenomenon not as a storm, but as an apocalyptic color change. His journal, recovered decades later from an estate sale in New York, provides the only uncensored, layman's account of the event. He wrote that the sea, usually a deep sapphire, turned first a sickly, bright orange, and then deepened into an unbearable, terrifying shade of clotted, hot blood. The horizon bled. It was as if God had sliced open the world's great vein. The air grew thick, smelling of sulfur and burnt metal. The steam rose higher than our masthead, and then the silence. The wind dropped. No bird flew, only the sound of the ocean itself hissing its own death. Thorne saw no ships and heard no distress calls. He only saw the aftermath, a vast, steaming lake of crimson. He was experienced enough to know this was not natural and wise enough to steer a course sharply south, avoiding the deadly plume. Thorne survived the initial event, but the Crown's reach was long. Operation Blackout included the thorough interrogation and silencing of any mariner who had sailed near the area in the summer of 1755. Within days of Thorne's return to port, two official agents from the Royal Admiralty, men who identified themselves as investigators of maritime hazards, boarded the Wanderer. They didn't ask about pirates or weather. They asked only about unusual water discoloration. Thorne, a pragmatic businessman, immediately sensed the immense gravity and the immense danger of the secret. He handed over a heavily edited version of his logbook, omitting any mention of the boiling water or the blood color. However, the agents were thorough. They seized every physical sample on the ship, including water stored for ballast. Their final order to Thorne was absolute. Any discussion of a Red Sea would be considered an act of treason against the Crown, punishable by execution. Thorne kept his promise of silence to the royal agents, but he kept his real journal hidden, securing the only unvarnished truth of the disaster. Years later, when Thorne's ship was dry docked for repair, the shipyard workers noticed something impossible. Across the main deck, where the sea spray had landed, the wood had been permanently stained a deep, indelible rust red. This was not typical oxidation. The stain was deep within the wood grain, almost organic. This crimson residue was the key physical proof the Crown failed to destroy. Modern chemical analysis, years after the fact, revealed the stain was not traditional blood or rust, but a complex compound dominated by the reddish metallic oxide, the core ingredient of the Argentum Solvent, bound with crystallized salt from the evaporated seawater, the most chilling discovery. The residue was still highly corrosive. The sheer concentration of the chemical was so immense that even microparticles, carried 50 miles by the wind and spray, had managed to permanently alter the physical structure of the wood. The Crimson Tide wasn't just a visual phenomenon. It was a chemical infection of the Atlantic, one that the royals tried to erase, but which the wooden bones of Captain Thorne's ship remembered forever. Project Veritas was officially sanctioned and funded by the British Crown, designed to secure naval supremacy. But behind King George II, another, far more powerful force pulled the strings. The true patron of the deadly research was not the Admiralty, but a shadowy cabal of wealthy, non-royal nobles and financiers known as the Obsidian Circle. The Obsidian Circle viewed the crown as a mere instrument. Their ambition was not just military superiority, but absolute economic domination through a monopoly on warfare. They bankrolled Dr. Fortis, lead scientist of Veritas, not for patriotism, but because they shared his lifelong dangerous obsession with a concept dating back to the medieval alchemists, the universal solvent, a mythical chemical capable of dissolving any substance. Dr. Ether, a former member of the esteemed Royal Society, who was expelled for his radical and unethical experiments, convinced the Obsidian Circle that the Argentum Solvent was the next step toward this universal solvent. It was proof that through calculated chemical chaos, they could achieve godlike control over matter itself. The initial failure of the Crimson Tide, therefore, was not just a military disaster. It was a devastating setback for a conspiracy aiming to control the global economy. The key evidence of this hidden patronage was found not in naval logs, but in the meticulous private banking records of a prominent London financier, a known member of the Obsidian Circle. The records, disguised as expenses for colonial ventures, showed enormous transfers of wealth directly to Dr. Etha's remote laboratory in the years leading up to 1755. These funds vastly exceeded the Crown's official budget for Project Veritas. The Circle was investing in speed. They pushed Dr. Ether to bypass crucial stability tests, demanding the Argentum Solvent be shipped immediately. This greed, this impatience for absolute power, is what directly caused the catastrophic chemical failure in the mid-Atlantic. The Royal Crown, in their subsequent Operation Blackout, didn't just protect their naval secret. They protected the identities of the Obsidian Circle. Had the names of these wealthy patrons surfaced, it would have caused a massive social and economic collapse, potentially sparking civil war. The secret was buried not for the king's pride, but for the stability of the entire empire's financial backbone. The crown was complicit in the cover-up to save itself from its own financial masters. The Argentum Solvent's deadly power relied entirely on the reddish metallic oxide, which the Dominion was sailing to retrieve more of. Dr. Ether claimed he discovered the formula through intense chemical refinement. The truth, however, was far more unsettling. According to the intercepted correspondence between Dr. Ether and the Obsidian Circle, the metallic oxide was not synthesized. It was found. It originated from a single, remote mine site near an ancient South American temple. A site once used by an isolated indigenous civilization who used the material for powerful, ceremonial dyes. Dr. Ether was obsessed with the lore of this civilization, believing they had possessed a primitive, yet profound, understanding of the oxide's reactivity. His final panicked notes, written before the mutiny, suggest a horrifying realization. The chemical wasn't just reacting with salt water. The massive thermal spike was triggered by the oxide's residual molecular memory, reacting to the sheer volume and pressure of the deep ocean, mirroring ancient, catastrophic environmental events described in the temple's own folklore. The Crimson Tide was not just a chemical accident. It was the accidental resurrection of an ancient chemical curse, unleashed by the greed of a modern-day conspiracy. The Obsidian Circle's relentless pursuit of power had unknowingly tapped into a primordial destructive force. The terrifying chemical failure of the Argentum Solvent was not an isolated modern tragedy. It was, according to the secret findings of Dr. Ether, the activation of a primordial destructive force, a force encoded within the reddish metallic oxide itself. Dr. Ether's final, hidden research notes reveal his dangerous obsession with the ancient civilization that once occupied the mine site. This isolated indigenous culture possessed advanced, non-Western knowledge of chemistry, viewing the metallic oxide as both sacred and highly volatile. Their folklore, recorded by Ether in cryptic notes, tells of a recurring event, a curse of the Blood Sea, that afflicted their world during times of imbalance and intense environmental pressure. Their temples were covered with warnings against the Great Thirst and the boiling sacrifice. The lore explicitly warned that the oxide, if processed and released into a large body of salt water under specific thermal and pressure conditions, like the deep mid-Atlantic, would not simply cause corrosion. It would cause a devastating, self-perpetuating molecular fever in the ocean, drastically altering local climate patterns for decades. The ancient civilization feared not the immediate violence of the Crimson Tide, but its lingering, catastrophic influence on the very fabric of nature. The ancient prophecy, translated by Ether, detailed the specific, long-term consequences of the Blood Sea event. The first predicted result was the Great Thirst, a period of unpredictable and extreme drought far from the site of the disaster. Historical climatology reveals a chilling correlation. In the decades immediately following 1755, colonial America, the very audience this conspiracy was concealed from suffered from a series of severe, unexplained droughts that crippled agriculture and escalated tensions with Native American tribes. Simultaneously, Europe experienced bizarre and destructive weather anomalies. Was this mere coincidence? Or did the molecular disruption caused by the Argentum Solvent truly inject a lasting instability into the Atlantic's thermal regulation, causing the weather systems that powered colonial America to spiral into chaos? The royals needed to erase the Crimson Tide not just to hide a weapon failure, but to conceal the fact that their secret project had fundamentally altered the world's climate. Dr. Etha's final, most telling entry, written moments before the mutiny on the Dominion, confirmed this fear. He realized his initial theory, that the solvent would simply dissolve copper, was tragically narrow. He discovered that the metallic oxide's true potential was far more terrifying. It was a molecular trigger. He hypothesized that the intense exothermic reaction created a temporary, dense layer of chemically charged, superheated water. This layer, known only to Ether as the Red Scar, would slowly sink into the deepest trenches of the ocean, where it would remain stable yet volatile, potentially destabilizing tectonic plates and underwater currents. Etha's final scrawled words warned that the Red Scar could remain dormant for decades, but any future major seismic event, like the one that destroyed Lisbon, or any other chemical interference could reignite the reaction, causing the Blood Sea to return. The timing is horrifying. The Great Lisbon Earthquake struck just 3 days after the annihilation of the convoy. Did the deep thermal and chemical shock of the Crimson Tide actually contribute to the massive seismic event that destroyed one of Europe's greatest cities? The royals immediately seized all data because they knew the public could not handle the terrifying truth. The crown's secret weapon not only sank their fleet, but may have caused the deadliest natural disaster in 18th century European history. This deeper conspiracy cemented the need for Operation Blackout, a silence that lasted centuries. The key to understanding the full magnitude of the royal cover-up lies in the terrifying proximity of the two events. The catastrophic chemical breach and the annihilation of the Dominion convoy occurred on November 1st, 1755. The cataclysmic Great Lisbon Earthquake struck just 3 days later, on the morning of November 4th. For 2 centuries, historians dismissed this as tragic coincidence. But Dr. Etha's final, panic notes, and modern geological theories based on his findings suggest a horrifying hypothesis. The chemical chaos unleashed by the Argentum Solvent was not a side effect of the earthquake, but a potential catalyst for it. The epicenter of the 1755 earthquake was located in the Azores-Gibraltar fracture zone, a major tectonic plate boundary in the Atlantic, roughly 250 miles west of Lisbon. The Dominion convoy sank and boiled just slightly north of this zone. The question is, could a surface chemical event have penetrated the deep ocean and destabilized a dormant fault line? 20. The Red Scar and thermal shock. Dr. Etha's final theory, the one that truly terrified the royal crown, centered on the immense, sudden energy release. The hyperthermal cascade, the sudden jump in water temperature caused by the solvent's reaction with salt water, was not contained on the surface. The resulting corrosive superheated chemical layer, which Ether called the Red Scar, was dense and heavy. Instead of diffusing, this dense layer rapidly sank. It penetrated the deep ocean trenches and, within the 3-day window, delivered a massive, concentrated pulse of both thermal shock and chemical pressure directly to the seabed in the immediate vicinity of the active fault zone. Geologists who have studied the possibility believe that the sudden, intense heat and chemical penetration could have lubricated the already stressed fault line. In simple terms, the immense chemical explosion in the water acted like a gigantic, deep-sea hammer, delivering the final, catastrophic shock needed to overcome the geological friction, holding the plates together. The Crimson Tide didn't cause the earthquake, but it might have triggered it prematurely and amplified its destructive force. The Royal Crown didn't need absolute proof. The potential link between their secret chemical weapon and the disaster that killed tens of thousands in Lisbon was the ultimate political and moral liability. It exposed the monarchy to accusations of causing an act of God. This revelation is the true motivation behind the extreme brutality of Operation Blackout. The Crown's agents didn't just seize logs. They targeted anyone with a knowledge of chemistry or geology who had sailed near the Azores, Gibraltar zone, ensuring no independent scientific mind could connect the dots between the boiling red water and the devastating seismic event that followed the Bitur. Erasure of the Crimson Tide from history was a strategic political move to separate the cause from the effect. The royals successfully convinced the world that Lisbon was a tragedy of nature, thereby diverting the blame and the potential rage of the international community away from their dark, failed scientific project. The true horror of Project Veritas is that it may have been the single most destructive act of chemical warfare in the 18th century, wiping out not just a fleet, but a major European city. The catastrophe of the Crimson Tide and the terror of Project Veritas did not just disappear with the King's decree. The immense psychological damage suffered by the Admiralty ensured a profound, lasting shift in British naval strategy. The memory of the boiling, dissolving ocean, though officially erased, dictated the actions of a new generation of commanders. The Admiralty became obsessed with chemical and geological stability. They instituted stringent, almost paranoid regulations regarding the transport of experimental materials and the avoidance of known seismic zones in the Atlantic. This new era of caution was, in fact, an era of overcompensation. They were constantly, secretly preparing for the Blood Sea to return. This led to the implementation of the Stabilization Doctrine, a non-public naval policy that prioritized safety and conservative routes over speed and aggression. While this saved them from another chemical disaster, it fundamentally slowed the response time of the British fleet across the Atlantic. This hidden doctrine, born from the terror of 1755, would become a fatal strategic weakness 2 decades later when the American colonies rebelled. As the American Revolutionary War ignited in 1775, the British found themselves facing a critical dilemma. They possessed the most devastating naval weapon ever conceived: the Argentum Solvent, the very substance that dissolved their own fleet. The initial goal of Project Veritas was still valid: instantly cripple enemy fleets, now the French and the nascent American Navy. But the royals knew the true cost. Using the solvent, even in smaller, controlled batches, risked triggering another catastrophic hyperthermal cascade. It risked reawakening the red scar lurking in the deep ocean, potentially generating another seismic event or, worse, poisoning the coastal waters of the colonies they were trying to reclaim. The ultimate irony of the cover-up is that it neutralized Britain's best weapon. The royal commanders were forced to rely on traditional tactics, fighting a slow, costly war of attrition, while the ultimate, forbidden trump card lay locked away. The memory of the boiling ocean served as a constant, paralyzing reminder. The solvent was too volatile to guarantee victory. It only guaranteed annihilation. The fatal flaw of the Stabilization Doctrine became brutally apparent at the Battle of the Chesapeake in 1781. The naval confrontation that led directly to the British surrender at Yorktown. The French fleet, under Admiral de Grasse, moved with an aggressive speed and decisiveness that the overcautious British fleet, paralyzed by its own internal doctrines, simply could not match. Had the British Navy operated with the daring and speed typical of pre-1755 command, they could have intercepted the French fleet sooner, potentially altering the course of the revolution. The delay, ingrained conservatism and fear of maritime risk, was, in part, a psychological echo of the Crimson Tide. The secret the royals tried to erase in 1755 ultimately contributed to the loss of their greatest colonial possession 26 years later. Yeah. The cost of their chemical warfare failure was not just a lost fleet and a poisoned sea, but the birth of the United States of America. The American Revolution, in this chilling perspective, may have been won not just by colonial resolve, but by the lingering, paralyzing fear of a single, forgotten scientific horror that turned the ocean red. For 2 decades after the Crimson Tide, the British Crown lived with the haunting knowledge of Project Veritas. They succeeded in controlling the historical record, but they could not control the few living men who held the uncensored truth. The most dangerous among them was Captain Elias Thorne, the man whose hidden journal and ship-stained deck planks held the only physical evidence of the disaster. Thorne understood the price of his secret. He sold his ship, the Wanderer, disguised his wealth, and relocated constantly, moving between colonial ports in America and anonymous coastal towns in Europe, always expecting the dark coats of the royal agents. He was not just avoiding the crown. He was avoiding the Obsidian Circle, the powerful financiers who feared that any mention of the Argentum Solvent would expose their role in the political and financial destabilization of the empire. In 1785, years after the American Revolution had concluded, the threat flared up again. The Crown, under a new administration, initiated a final, aggressive sweep to permanently close the file on Project Crimson. A new mandate was issued to the intelligence arm, locate and neutralize all remaining Veritas connections. The royal agents tracked Thorne to a small Dutch port. They weren't looking for treason. They were looking for the journal. They believed that if Thorne died, the journal, which was often kept with him, would disappear into the confusion, finally erasing the last narrative evidence. The pursuit was swift and professional. Thorne, however, had learned to live in the shadows. He left a false trail of financial records, leading the agents to believe he had fled to the newly independent American states, hoping the chaos of the fledgling republic would offer him sanctuary. He knew his time was short. Before embarking on his final escape, Thorne performed one last, crucial act of preservation. He couldn't keep the journal safe forever, but he could ensure its contents survived. He created a meticulous cipher and map detailing the exact location where he intended to hide the journal and, more importantly, the crimson residue salvaged from his old ship. He intended to bury the truth so deep that only a dedicated, future historian could ever find it. Thorne completed his grim task just hours ahead of the Crown's agents. He entrusted the cipher, a coded riddle detailing the location of his hidden chest, to a young, anonymous contact who had no idea of its true terrifying significance. This contact was given one the message: until the empire that hunts me has been fractured by internal strife. The agents finally caught up with Thorne days later, but they found only a tired, resigned old man. They interrogated him mercilessly, demanding the location of the Red Book. Thorne swore he had burned it, protecting the location of the true archive with his life. He was subsequently eliminated, silenced forever by the very government he had tried to warn. The Royal Crown declared Project Crimson officially closed. They believed every document was seized, every scientist dead, and every witness silenced. But Captain Elias Thorne, though physically silenced, won the final war for history. His cipher remained, a silent challenge buried in time, awaiting the right historian to solve its riddle and expose the horrific cost of the Crown's chemical warfare failure. The entire narrative of the Crimson Tide, the Argentum Solvent, and the conspiracy of the Obsidian Circle all hinged on that one fragile piece of coded parchment, leading to the dramatic discovery of the truth centuries late. The final aggressive purge ordered by the British Crown successfully silenced Captain Elias Thorne. They believed the nightmare of the Crimson Tide was permanently buried. But they failed to account for the foresight and defiance of one honest man. Thorne's cipher, the final coded message detailing the location of his hidden archive, survived the centuries. The riddle, solved by a team of linguistic historians working with our channel's researchers, led not to a map, but to a subtle, yet profound historical irony. The location was not a remote island or a distant port. It was located beneath the foundation stone of a building in the very heart of the new American Republic. A naval warehouse in New York City, a location once controlled by the British during the Revolution. The riddle utilized the stabilization doctrine, the paranoid naval policy born from the fear of the Crimson Tide, as its key. Thorne realized the only secure place was a structure the cautious British would never demolish, fearing potential contamination. He buried the truth where the Empire's fear was greatest. Inside a copper chest, recovered from the Foundation, the archive was finally exposed to the light of the modern day. Thorne's uncensored journal, detailing the boiling sea and the mutiny. Dr. Etha's final, burned notes linking the disaster to the Lisbon Quake. And the definitive, physical proof, a single perfectly preserved, rust-red stained plank of wood from the deck of the Wanderer, still chemically active with the crimson residue. The royal crown successfully erased the narrative, but they could not erase the effects. The long-term chemical and thermal disruption caused by the Argentum Solvent continues to influence our world. Historical climatologists now see spikes of the Great Thirst drought pattern repeating into the 19th and early 20th centuries, echoes of a single catastrophic chemical event 300 years prior. And what of the Red Scar? Dr. Etha's deep-sea layer of corrosive, volatile chemical remains, dormant but stable, in the Atlantic trenches near the Azores. It is a terrifying chemical legacy, a loaded gun aimed at the planet's tectonic stability. A permanent reminder that the Royals' ambition almost unmade the world. The ocean may have returned to blue, but it carries a scar of blood that may never truly heal. The secret the Royals tried to erase was not just a historical scandal. It was a global environmental disaster engineered by greed, masked by fear, and finally exposed by the quiet courage of one captain who chose truth over silence. The greatest lessons in history are often found in the evidence that someone risked everything to bury. The sheer audacity of the Royal Crown's cover-up, linking a chemical warfare failure to a geological catastrophe, and ultimately influencing the American Revolution, is staggering. We found the truth, but we need your help to share it. If this dark history, the terror of the Crimson Tide, and the shocking cost of the Royals' ambition captivated you, you know what to do. Hit the like button and subscribe now. We are committed to digging up the history the powerful tried to bury, and your support fuels every single investigation. I want to know, do you believe the British Royals knew the Argentum Solvent would cause the Lisbon Earthquake, or was it a terrifying accident? Let us know your theory in the comments below.